Hey, good morning, everyone. So Jake said, hey, you have 15 minutes. Can you talk about what's going on in the economy? Also, just consumer trends, structural things. And 15 minutes, no problem at all. I will also be able to sneak in some NFL picks for the year, too. I think So listen, because there's not a lot of time, let me just kind of dive right into it. So here's what I want to do. First of all, let me just give you about a minute context on why I'm talking to you from the Fed. So most people think about the Fed, they think of one of two things. Oh no, they regulate my bank, we're in trouble. Or, more often than not, it is, why are interest rates so high and what are y'all doing about it? So I am on the monetary policy side. So I manage our Birmingham office here, cover the state of Alabama. We have some really smart economists. I got asked earlier, are you an economist? And I'm not. By trade, I was in the private sector most of my career. But we have a lot of smart economists. We look at a lot of data and we try to figure out where the economy's going. But as you all probably realize, data is backward looking. So it tells us where we've been, not necessarily where we're going. So part of my role is I go out and I talk to business execs, play by Vegas rules, and I try to get a sense of where they think the economy's going, what are they thinking about next quarter, or the next 6 months, or the next year. And then we really try to synthesize all that information in terms of data as well as forward guidance, and then hopefully go to Raphael Bostic, my boss, every few weeks before he goes to DC and give him the best information possible to figure out what decision to make with interest rates. So that's a quick version of what I do and why I talk to a lot of folks. So here's first of all, these are just my opinions, not the opinions of the Federal Reserve System or Chair Powell or President Bostic, but here's what I want to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about current conditions, but really within a broader framework of kind of what we're seeing as some trends. Now, keep in mind, I'm not the person to talk to about, hey, where's the consumer going to be in 20 years? But I can kind of tell you where we're seeing sort of business and the economy go. The first thing I would tell you is that growth has actually been pretty good for the last year. And then you see a little blip right here in Q1. And so that, oh no, we went negative. In fact, GDP Now, which is the Atlanta Fed's kind of GDP forecast tool, we got a lot of press that's like, hey, why are you predicting it to be negative? The interesting thing about GDP Now and kind of what we've seen in Q1 was growth itself was actually positive in terms of when you kind of think about final sales to domestic purchasers. The reason this was negative was because one of the elements of GDP Now or GDP growth is net exports. And in the last 3 months, what companies did was pull forward inventories in anticipation of tariffs to essentially avoid tariffs. So we saw a huge spike in imports coming in, which then reduced the net exports number, which caused GDP to go negative. So sometimes part of what I want to talk a little bit about is the story behind the macro data in terms of what we're seeing. But we're still predicting or projecting reasonable growth for this year. We're not predicting anything to be recessionary. I say that, and I will just be honest, I have zero confidence in my forecast, or in what we say. And I think if anybody tells you that they're pretty confident about where things are, I would run the other way. So what is kind of the big thing that we're seeing in terms of the macro economy? Well, understand that the consumer spend is 2/3 of the economy. Right? So businesses can do great, they may not do well. If consumers not doing well, things come to a halt very quickly. So on the macro level, the consumer spend seems to be resilient. In fact, I think periodically I kind of get the question like, well, if everybody's stressing, why are the numbers kind of coming in the right way? Well, what we're seeing is a real shift in terms of what is the composition of the strength of the consumer. Most of the strength of the consumer is now being held by the top 10% of income earners. So if you kind of look at income bands, 2 years ago, if you're in the bottom 35 percentile, you were in a recession. Last year, if you were in the bottom 50%, you were probably in a recession. Today, if you're in the top 75%, you are really financially stressed. We're seeing trade downs by consumers, whether it's casual dining to fast food, whether it's brand names to more generic things, really across the board, except for that top 10%. So what's happening is the macro data is saying, hey, the consumer's actually kind of holding up, but underneath that, no, it's actually being upheld by just a smaller and smaller percentage of our population. And that's kind of what the data shows us. The other thing I would want to mention is we've seen a couple of trends continue within the consumer in terms of, we talked about households, and so the households that are wealthiest are doing really well. And here's what's really interesting. I know a lot of you can't see this, but let's put aside absolute value numbers and just think about growth rates in consumer spend. So whether you're low-income household, median income, or high-income household, the absolute value of what you spend is going to vary. But the growth rate from year over year should be the same. And it has been the same. So if you're low income and you spend $100, if you're median income, you spend $1,000. The low income, if you grow 10%, that's to $110. Median income, that's $1,100. So the growth rate has always been the same, historically. That is not what's happened after COVID. We've seen the growth rate in consumer spend for higher income households grow at a much faster rate than the rate for medium and lower income households. So that really tends to reinforce this idea that I told you, that the top 10% of income earners are really shouldering more of the economic growth that we're seeing. The other generational issue, and by the way, I recognize the audience I'm talking to, y'all are going to know a lot more about the specifics of generational marketing and kind of what's driving consumer behavior than I will. But just from an economic data trend, it is interesting that that same growth rate that I was talking about, that had essentially been the same across generations, whether you were baby boomer, Gen Z, millennial, or Gen X, that's also bifurcated as well. So we're actually seeing millennials spend at a higher rate, whereas others' spending growth rates have kind of softened. And we're also seeing for the millennial spend more on services than on goods. And that's been kind of a transition. So it's very much the experience economy, right? I always tell the story, my daughter's 20, and now that she's on her own budget, she has her own money in college, she is very, very wise using her money. She wasn't so much with my money, but she's that way. So she watches, she doesn't go to Starbucks, she doesn't need to spend $4 or $5. But she spent several $100s on a concert ticket, which was just really kind of blew my mind. I'm like, well, you know how many trips to Starbucks that you just kind of give up? And to her, 3 hours at this concert was well worth $600. But getting a cup of coffee every day, that just didn't do much, for her. And I think we see that more. So as we kind of think about where the economy goes from an inflation standpoint, we look at demand for goods versus demand for services. And we've seen a faster growth in the demand for services in the economy. So people are actually substituting more for services than they are for goods. The key trick is, and again, I say this to a room full of folks that live and breathe this stuff every day, the key trick that we hear is, can you make your good part of an experience, right? So can you somehow convert that good into an experience that sort of millennials will be glad to spend any amount of money on? So here's part of what we're seeing with the consumer, and that is stresses have been seen in a lot of different places, but savings rate. So first of all, Americans have never been great about saving. We don't save like the rest of the world, because there are lots of other parts of the world where you can't buy a house for like 5% down. I mean, you have to essentially buy the house, so you learn how to save at a much greater propensity. Before the pandemic, households typically saved at about 8%, 9% rate. It really skyrocketed during the pandemic because a lot of money came in, but people didn't have any place to spend that money, so deposits swelled up. Well, savings today are at about 3 or 4%. They are less than where they were pre-pandemic levels. So there are a lot of financial stresses that the average household and the consumer are having to trade off. And one of the big ones is housing. Now, there are a couple of points I would make about housing and kind of how it impacts the consumer spend. First is, one of the things that, if you think about the rule of thumb for how much should you spend on a house, the basic rule of thumb would be not more than 30% of your gross income should go towards housing expense, right? So if you use that bottom line, where we are right now as a society on a macro level is more than 40% of people's gross income, household gross income, is going towards housing costs. And there are two factors. Obviously, the cost of houses have gone up, but the second factor that gets understated a lot is when we think about buying a house, we think of P&I, principal interest on a mortgage. Well, most everybody has a really great interest rate locked in. Most everybody has a 3% or so. That's not the issue. The issue is the escrow payment. It's the property taxes and insurance. The compounded annual growth rate, or CAGR, from 2019 to 2023 for escrow payments in Alabama was 44%, from, again, over a 5-year period. So what most people think of as discretionary income, so when you make a housing decision, most people don't think of, I wonder what my escrow payment is going to be. They think of what their mortgage rate is going to be. So it is a bit of sticker shock when all of a sudden their property taxes and their insurance has gone up. And again, it's gone up because home prices have gone up, which then raises the replacement cost of these items. So when that doubles or even goes up 250%, that creates real strain on the household budget that has not factored in housing to be a variable cost. People think of housing as a fixed cost that you've locked in with a great rate. By the way, I'm going really fast, so if you have questions or if I'm saying something that is not registering, please just stop me at any point in time. So I'm going to shift a little bit to where the consumer is relative to labor markets. And this is one of the most important things we look at the Fed. At the Fed, we have a dual mandate. Most people think of the Fed as, hey, you've got to control inflation. And that is part of the dual mandate. What a lot of people don't realize is we have two parts of a dual mandate. The other part is maximize employment. We got to make sure that labor markets are strong. So when the Fed thinks about should we cut rates, should we increase rates, what should we do with rates? One element is, we increase rates because we're worried about inflation, we want to stifle demand, but we can't increase them too much to where demand slows down so much that there are layoffs and then the labor market suffers. So it's a balancing act. Listen, I could show 15 different metrics that we look at for how healthy labor markets are, but I just used one composite measure that we like to look at, looking at labor market momentum. And generally speaking, momentum for the labor markets is pretty healthy. We don't see a lot of layoffs just across the board. There are certainly pockets of it, and I'll tell you why that's really important for the consumer. One of the biggest predictors of where consumer spend goes is the security you feel about having a job. Because if you don't feel comfortable that you're going to have a job, you don't tweak your spending. You're not trading down. You're stopping spending altogether. And that reverberates throughout the economy. So the labor market, in some ways, is a really important measure because if people don't feel like they are not in control of whether they get fired or laid off, they will continue to spend. They may tweak spend, but they'll continue to spend, and that kind of keeps the economy humming. When we start seeing layoffs and then sort of reductions in force, that's when all bets are off. And then consumers really start pulling back on everything except pay the mortgage and cell phone and Netflix. So that's part of what we are looking at. And so far, it's held up pretty well. But as y'all probably know, there are a number of different factors that come into play in terms of where the labor markets are going. And one of the, a lot of what we look at is beyond unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. And we try to slice and dice data in terms of where we think labor markets are going in the next few years. I'll mention a couple of structural changes that we're seeing in the labor markets. One is, women have returned to the workforce very differently. In fact, one of the reasons that we've seen greater labor force participation today in the prime age work group between 25 and 54 is because women are more engaged in the workforce than they were pre-pandemic. And the biggest reason for that is the hybrid work posture, being able to work remote. When the pandemic hit in April 2020, 1.7 million married women with kids under the age of 6 dropped out of the workforce. And they've all come back, but they've come back in droves. I heard one CEO describe the ability to work in different ways as 40 flavors of vanilla. So you can really kind of label how you want to engage in the workforce, whereas for a lot of women with children, there are really two ways. Do you want to work 60 hours a week or do you want to work 30? And that was basically it, and that was in the office. So we've seen a lot of greater participation, and that certainly had an impact on things like productivity, on greater ability of labor force participation. And then millennials, Gen Z, and y'all kind of know this, just the way millennials and Gen Z interact with the workplace is different. It's not just a hybrid work, it's, we've actually seen data on typically Gen Z, millennials, they will monetize the value of being able to work from home. That you can essentially get an 8% discount, on compensation if you provide them additional benefits. So it's really caused HR, human resources throughout the country to rethink what their benefit structure looks like in terms of how they engage and keep people in the workplace. So the last thing on immigration I'll mention, one of the things that people have not realized is in the last 5 years, 30% of all job growth was immigrant workers, is foreign-born workers. So when we think about where immigration policy is going, it's really important for us to think about population trends. And this is hard to see, but the punchline in this chart is we are not having babies. We are not producing kids. Immigrant labor has really been the one thing that has kept us essentially having a stronger labor force. It actually reverses by 2035, where we will have net negative in terms of births here in the US. So part of what we have to think about structural trends in labor markets is how do we compensate for immigration policy if it turns more negative? Because it's been a real stalwart in keeping labor force participation high. Josh is going to talk more about AI. Certainly he's going to talk a lot about AI. The one point that I would make when we think about GDP growth in the economy, GDP is actually a very, very simple tool. All it measures is two things. If you really distill, all the sort of the higher level economics, it's how many hours are people working and how productive are they in the hours that they work. So output times number. I mean, it's Q times P, P being productivity, right? So the trick to GDP, the cheat code, is if you can find productivity gains, because it's really hard, not just with immigration, but other things, it's hard to increase the number of hours worked. But if you can find a cheat code for productivity, that's kind of the key. So one of the things that we're really interested in, and I think Josh can certainly address is, what does productivity growth look like with something like Gen AI or with technologies? Typically there's been like a 25-year ramp up in technology adoption from the time that it kind of gets introduced to the time where it actually hits macro numbers. Is Gen AI on that same ramp? AI has been around for about 15 years or so. So what does the next 5 to 10 years look like in terms of adoption and really kind of hitting GDP? Final thing that I will mention, and hopefully I'm okay on time, what I want to mention is, so I couldn't do this presentation without talking about trade tariffs a little bit. There is a tremendous amount of uncertainty that's out there. And a lot of what I hear from businesses is like, look, I'm not even even if it's a policy that sucks, we would rather have a policy that sucks than a policy that we don't know what it is. So what really is hitting businesses is we don't know what next week is going to be like, what next month is going to be like, what sort of 3 months is going to be like. And we don't know that either, obviously, the Fed. We don't know where trade and tariff policy comes down. One of the things that we're very confident about, and I can tell you from everybody I've talked to, as well as a lot of the survey data that we look at, as tariffs come in, those costs are going to get passed through. Nobody's out here saying, you know what, I think we'll take this on the margin for the good of the country. Nobody is saying that. Everybody's like, whatever we get charged, we're going to kind of pass through. The key question, of course, that we ask at the Fed, so that's the intent. And the greater sensitivity that your business has to trade the tariffs, even though a lot of supply chains diversify, the more likely you are to see an inflationary impact on costs and prices. But here's a question that we don't know, and that I talk to folks like y'all all the time. Yeah, but it's like the old Mike Tyson saying, everybody's got a plan until they get hit. So what happens if you increase prices? I've shown you how stressed the consumer is. And the consumer says, yeah, we're not going to buy it. Business says, yeah, that's all right. Because we're already seeing that happen. I mean, we're seeing businesses defer CapEx, say, you know what, I can go, we're seeing, consumers say, yeah, I can drive this car another year. I really need another car, but I can kind of do without it. That's when you see companies say, well, wait a minute, I know we talked about increasing prices, but we don't want to lose market share, we don't want to lose our customer, let's kind of come back on prices. Let's put in more discounts, let's put in more promotionals. Let's essentially reduce our effective pricing again to keep market share. Well, when that happens, no company I know likes just like smaller margins. So they look for other places to kind of keep margins. And what's the next available source? Labor expense. And that's when you start potentially getting into reductions in force. And that's what potentially creates that cycle of, all right, now is this going to impact consumer spend? So this idea of the real kind of golden question is, can the intent of increasing prices actually be followed through without a drop in consumer spend? And then we don't know the answer to that question, but that will really define whether the bigger threat to the economy is inflation, or is it lesser growth, or is it contractionary growth? Right? Thank you.
Great. So if you thought Anoop talked fast, I'm going to talk faster. So I've got a lot of content here, and I'll try and condense it to things that I have about an hour. So, but I'm excited to talk to you guys about AI today. I'll probably fast forward through a couple of these slides, but just to tell you briefly who I am, what I do. Work in data science and AI and have for the past couple of decades now. Originally helping companies build and execute data science and AI strategy. So Quant Hub is an educational platform. We teach skills like data fluency, AI fluency, and we'll actually talk about some of that today, so I'll give you a little bit more perspective. While we serve every industry from DoD to corporate, we've done a lot of work with McKinsey, Southern Company, Blue Cross. Our passion is actually in the education sector. So we have about 100 schools in Alabama that are actually teaching these skills in STEM courses in high school. We also have most of the universities in the state are now using Quant Hub as a course curriculum for different classes. So what I'll do very briefly, I'll talk a little bit about the industry landscape, kind of give you a big macro picture. I'll give you a couple of sort of potpourri, some practical applications of AI. I understand some of you are using it quite extensively, some of you are just barely touching the surface. And then also towards the end, what I'll do is actually give you a quick case study of Quant Hub. We are a Birmingham-based company, about 20 employees, and we are an AI-first company, meaning we use AI extensively everywhere across the organization. And then hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions at the end. So a bit of context. So this is a graph, you can't see the numbers, which is fine. It's called Moore's Law, and it's a logarithmic scale. And the idea is that Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel back in the 60s, observed that every 2 years, the number of microchips on these transistors is doubled. And so we've noticed this trend has continued for 60 years. If you're like me, you say, surely this is going to stop at some point. There's only so much physical space. When is this going to end? This is the world's smallest computer 5 years ago, to give you an example of where we are. This is built by IBM. It's sitting on a grain of rock salt over here. That's 64 of them put together on the right. So a millimeter square, this was the smallest I could find about 5 years ago. There's a newer one that I cut out of these slides, but this one, for example, is about 2 or 3 years old. It's called the Michigan Micro Moat. It's 1/10 of the size of the one that I just showed you. And to give you perspective, that is a grain of rice that's sitting next to it. So it is 1/10 the width of the grain of rice. So I think it's safe to say that this trend is going to continue, that we're seeing newer and newer ways for them to figure out how to pack more into that space. And so what we're seeing is this ubiquity of smart things, smart belts that tell you had too much for lunch, or a hairbrush that tells you you're going bald. Everywhere, because the cost of these sensors is dropping, our ability to capture data is increasing exponentially. And if you think a smart hairbrush is new technology, that was released 8 years ago. So we're seeing more and more of this happen. So this creates these two trends that I want you to remember if you hear nothing else I say. One of these is the amount of data being created in the world is increasing exponentially. At the same time, the cost for us to process and analyze that data is decreasing exponentially. So when we talk about these large language models, I think I cut that slide from here. We talk about these large language models, instead of doubling every 2 years, we're seeing them double about every 3 to 6 months. So this technology, when we talk about generative AI, as Anoop mentioned, it's been around really the early stage of AI 40, 50 years. And a lot of these models that you see ChatGPT using are not new concepts. we finally hit a threshold where our ability to process that data, the cost of processing that data, has enabled us to start doing things that really change the game, what we consider possible. Accenture a couple years ago, after ChatGPT came out, looked across industries and said, wow, this is huge. What is the potential for impact in terms of automation, augmentation, based on AI? You guys are a marketing crowd. I did this with a legal audience a couple of months ago, and I had to point out that they were estimating 99% impact to the legal industry. 99%. So on average, they're seeing about 40% impact. And I'll give you a QR code at the end if you want to download some iteration of these slides. You're more than welcome to. And so usually at this point in the talk, we start thinking, oh no, we're going to be replaced. We got movie buffs, 2001: Space Odyssey, Hal pushing humans out of the spaceship. I would suggest that is one perspective that many people have, and it's a perspective you can have. Or you can really flip that and say, let's take a different movie version of AI and think about Iron Man. How can we actually use this to be 2.5 times as effective? So either 40% of me is getting taken away, or now I can use these tools to do things that I couldn't do before, didn't have the time to do before. And so it really is a matter of perspective, and we're seeing sort of this increasing tale of two cities in terms of people that adopt these changes versus those that, what I call ostrich, they just sort of stick their heads in the sand and say, I hope this will go away. So one more thought on this big macro. McKinsey a couple years ago estimated that about every 10 years, our job churn was about 1% a year, 10% over 10 years. And by job churn, what I mean is this idea that you no longer have the video store clerks, you now have YouTube influencers. And so this is not people losing their jobs and getting rehired, but entire job codes disappearing, and then new jobs being created, new types of income, if you will. Okay, so a couple years ago, 10% over 10 years, 1% CAGR, plus or minus, right? So the World Economic Forum meets in Davos every year. They release this Future of Jobs report, 300-page document, interview thousands of CEOs and say, essentially the questions that Anoop is talking to people about, where you see things going. And basically they're estimating 23% over 5 years. Okay, so that's about 4.5% a year. So if we're talking a minute ago about household economics, and you go from a place where, a lot of your wealth is in a, 1% money market account. Like if I told you today, the vast majority of my savings are in a money market, it would be 1%. You would slap me and say, you're an idiot. Like you got to at least be getting 4 or 5%, right? Because if you're not, you're losing money. Well, we're seeing that same thing in terms of skill inflation. That if we're seeing this job chart at 23% over 5 years, the rate of inflation of the skills and the tasks that you need to go to complete your job is changing faster than it's ever happened before. And so a lot of the message that I speak to groups and audiences and things like that is just, you've got to realize that this is not something you just get out of college and say, I'm done, I'm ready for my 30-year career, I'll get a couple of continuing education units at the end of the year. Interestingly, that World Economic Forum report, they looked at what are the top skills that companies are hiring for, what are they training for. Notice number 3 there, technological literacy. So we call that data literacy, AI literacy as well, and I'll touch on that in just a moment here. Notice some of the bottom skills, reading, writing, and math, or computer software programming. So we're seeing a major shuffling of what companies are actually investing their money in from a training and upskilling standpoint. When we talk about AI literacy, what we're talking about here is really this ability to understand the world around you, the tools, the technologies, and capabilities that you as an individual can use. This is different than sort of your old school AI, and I'm going to learn Python and machine learning. And so when I talk about that, that's sort of a different thing. It's like how to build a lawnmower is different than how to cut your grass, right? So when we talk about AI here in the AI literacy space, I'm really talking more about how do we leverage these new tools that have come on the market to be impactful in your job. So 5 of the different areas that we talk about when we talk about AI literacy are really, first of all, understanding what's out there, what are the tools, what does this look like. The second is ethics and responsible usage. I realize that to some people, ethics is a boring subject, but it's incredibly important when it comes to generative AI. If you're taking something that's proprietary, that's IP or whatever, and you're handing it to a third party that may or may not be somebody that's trustworthy, there's a lot to talk about there. Practical schools until skill mastery. Just what are the different skills that I need to understand and think about, and I'll touch on a couple of those today as well. Critical evaluation and assessment. And I trust this model that I'm using. And I'll kind of double click on each of these as we go. And that last one is really social impact. So how is this changing jobs and the world around me? Okay, so I think Dan warned me this is the point where everybody starts falling asleep in the session. We're about 45 minutes in. So, I want to show you guys, hopefully the audio will work on this. I want to start giving you just some different examples in the marketing industry. Has anybody heard of Udio, UDIO? All right, so you're gonna learn something, at least one new tool today. This one you can create music. It writes the lyrics. It actually creates the audio, the everything. So I'll show you a quick 60-second clip here.
I tell you fellas, I've been caught out doing something I really shouldn't. Gonna plead ignorance, gonna tell them about how if I'd have known better, I just wouldn't. Oh. This drink turpentine ain't where it's at. Insurance fraud is a federal crime. Well, I didn't know that. You're telling me now for the first time.
Sorry. Sorry about the audio there. So this is actually a 4-minute song. I encourage you to YouTube this. It's on YouTube, and I haven't seen it on Spotify, but lots of songs like that, blues, jazz. I mean, it's amazing how good these things are getting to the point where I actually will confess, I occasionally listen to this when I'm not talking. It's a great song.
Did you know it took 3 civilizations to invent eye cream? It all started in ancient...
So I'll keep moving. But the amount of just full audio and video that you're beginning to see that's 100% AI generated is really changing the table stakes around who in your organization can do these types of things and what skills are needed by each employee. Again, for lack of time, I won't go deep into this, but I will suggest, how many people have used generative AI? Raise your hand. How many have used something besides ChatGPT? Okay, so a decent amount. So if you think about these different models like Claude, Gemini, Perplexity, what we see is if you look at the benchmark scores, they each tend to have different areas that they excel in. And so depending on the task, one of the things we encourage through AI literacy is understanding what is the right tool for the particular application. And just because ChatGPT is the best known doesn't mean it's always the best. For example, software engineers tend to say that Claude has much better models. Gemini 2.5 has gotten a lot better as well. So understanding this is one of the areas that I would encourage you just to become literate, if you will. Another one is something called context windows. Essentially, when you upload documents to these to create context, and this is actually changing all the time as well. But Gemini tends to, at last check, you could do 2,500 pages with Gemini, whereas you can only do about 500 with Claude. Now that's just text. If you do like a PDF, it actually shrinks even further. So sometimes I may like Claude as a better model for writing things, but if I've got a large context window, say a large document, I may start in Gemini and get it to summarize everything and then bring that back over into one of the other documents to make it a lot more meaningful. Another thing that I'll do that I would encourage you to try, figure out what your hourly value is. Like, just what are you worth per hour? And then all of these models, the advanced versions, cost $20 a month. Do the math on the ROI of investing in these. I've told my entire company, if you want any AI tool, you get it. All that I ask is every quarter we're going to review and say, are you still using this? So I've got pro subscriptions to basically, 10 different models, and every now and then I'll come back, just like my streaming services, and go cut the ones that I'm not using. But I found what I can do is I'll have Claude and ChatGPT up at the same time. I'll either get them both the same prompt and see who gives me a better result, or I'll copy from one, paste it in the other, and say, check the work. And we won't get into prompt engineering today, but there's a lot you can do with just some simple productivity hacks. The more you use these, you start to get fluent in knowing, well, I'm writing a document, so Claude tends to be better at that. Okay, I'm researching, I like how Gemini does that. I'm doing some strategy, I like how ChatGPT does that, those sorts of things. So I highly encourage you not just to stick with one model. Here's another one that's worth playing around with. It's called Cube.ai, and it actually will take audio and can extract emotion, sentiment. So if you're doing call center work, things like that, it's a great tool to play around with. They've actually got a model. I think one of the ones I had up is detected Parkinson's, and it's like 99% accurate based on just a voice recording. And so back in the Biden hubbub, I actually pulled a bunch of his speeches and ran it through this, and it said no, he doesn't have Parkinson's. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But it's actually quite a few different applications there. Okay, I've got about 6 or 7 more minutes here. Notebook LM by Google. So you want to try this? Okay, this you can upload basically a raw text file, and it will create a podcast with 2 different voices. And so it's not verbatim, but it's actually interesting enough to listen to. So as a quick test, hopefully the audio will work with me on this one. I uploaded some song lyrics. Thought this would be interesting to see what it does, just take song lyrics. So listen here and see if you can figure out which song they're referring to.
Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to dive deep into some lyrics.
Okay.
Some lyrics that on the surface seem to be, all about a committed romantic relationship. But there were these recurring lines and they almost feel like promises being made.
Right.
And so that's kind of what we're going to unpack together.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think what's interesting about them is how the text doesn't jump into this sort of, fiery new romance. There's an undercurrent of history there, of shared experience.
Oh, for sure. Like right off the bat, you get, we're no strangers to love. Like that right there makes me think this isn't just, some first blush of adoration.
Exactly. It implies this bond that has a past and maybe even some baggage. And that kind of shared history could really color promises that we see later on.
If they're building on something,
Yeah.
it already established, for better or for worse, which kind of makes the next line even more interesting, at least to me. You wouldn't get from any other guy. It sounds a little possessive, doesn't it?
We're going to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
Couldn't help myself. So Google's Veo, if you haven't tried it, you can upload text. Notice just this one line of text here, and it creates a pretty good B-roll video, about 2 seconds. OpenAI has one called Sora. Again, this is available with the $20 a month package, the Gemini Advanced. So pretty fascinating stuff here. AI ethics. Quick poll of the audience. I've got 3 different paintings here. Bill, I expect you to get this one right. How many of you like the image on the left the most? How many of you like the image in the middle the most? How many like the one on the right the most? How many refuse to those both? Okay, so I think I got about a little bit more for the one on the right, 1 or 2 for the middle. So the one on the left is Vincent Van Gogh, and it recently sold for $40 million in auction. The one in the middle is Millet, and it sold for about $800,000. The one on the right is me and my 11-year-old in mid-journey, and it's for sale. So we spent about 10 minutes on that. And when we spend more time in our courses on ethics, so there's this question around, can you do that? Is it okay for models to copy other people? I pulled this because I thought it was interesting that Van Gogh actually, I have a number of his works, copying Delacroix and others. It's like, you can tell clearly Millet probably deserves some royalties from Van Gogh's painting. And so a lot of questions we could dig into here with more time, like, is this art? Is this right? Is it ethical? So there's a lot of conversations. We do a lot of work in the university setting, and so thinking about how universities are setting policies around can students use GPT, things like that. When is it okay? When is it not? Valuation, I think probably some of you saw the news with DeepSeek, the Chinese models. Early on, if you asked about Tiananmen Square, it would start answering the question and then back up and say, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And so we as Americans kind of snicker at that. But if you look at most of the models before their training layer that says don't teach about bombs and that sort of thing, David Rosado, a researcher, did some tests. I don't know if you can see right here, but essentially they're right in the center politically. If you ask them political questions, they'll respond. However, that's not the model that you get. The model you get that's ready for public consumption. Pretty much all of the models skew left and libertarian. So we watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Hopefully everybody, whichever one you switch on, you understand there's a worldview that they're presenting. And there's, subscriber base or that's employee marketers, of course, it is, right? But do you think about that when you use ChatGPT? Do you think about it when you use Perplexity? Well, it's actually happening. So this whole concept of critical evaluation becomes even increasingly more critical as we use these as a thought marker, a strategy marker. What should I do about this? How should I respond to this HR issue? So understanding these critical outputs, and I think it was Mark Twain who said a strong opinion adds 10 points to your IQ. This idea that I'm sure you talk to people that are really opinionated, and as a result, they sort of strike you as smarter, you want to trust what they're saying. We kind of get that same effect from these models when they're essentially predicting the truth, and they may or may not be right. We just assume, oh, they know more than I do because I didn't do that thing, therefore I can trust them. Okay, very quick, and I'll wrap. Quant Hub approach. I mentioned earlier we use AI across the business. One of the things that we do that's fairly simple is we'll use projects. If you haven't done this, I highly recommend it. Gemini calls it gems. ChatGPT calls it custom GPTs. Basically, you can take documents, like in our case, I'll take press releases, flyers, news clippings, you name it, and then compile them all. I'll do like an all about Quant Hub. Save that in a project, and I'll have one that's like my marketer. I'll have another one that's my HR specialist, and another one that's my corporate attorney or whatever. I'll use the pro versions because if you use the free versions, you're actually giving away your information. Obviously, we're a lot more careful on our IT audits. We have a lot more stringent requirements there. But what this allows me to do is very low-level questions that when I'm asking about something, it's a very quick and easy way to spin up something that can save you a lot of time. So think about writing grant applications or invoices and so forth. The other thing that we've done is to give you a perspective in education, we have full course curriculum, and we do applied data science and full data science or math course in high school. We have AI literacy in higher ed. One exciting thing, Bill Folzar, who's with us, is actually going to be teaching marketing at Alabama in the fall. We're partnering with them to do an AI and marketing course, and so it's going to be specifically a whole semester of how do we leverage these AI tools. We'll also be exploring a lot of other applications. But one of the reasons that I mentioned that, so this is our platform as you go through, it's kind of like Duolingo for AI, so it's gamified, you get points for right answers, you lose marks or lives for wrong answers. And one of the things I'll say is, I'm going to fast forward through some of this. All of the articles that we teach, we have, let me give you an example. When you're scrolling through these articles, they're built out of HTML, so they'll have widgets, they'll have videos, they'll have all sorts of manipulatives. Everything that we deliver is actually being built by AI. So I should say everything. 85% of what we build is being built by AI. And the way that we do that is we actually wrap subject matter experts around large language models. We don't trust AI to be left to its own devices. We believe it can kind of accelerate what we're doing and make it a lot easier and faster. But we use a tool called Cursor. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Cursor. There's a lot of them out there like Lovable and Bolt. But essentially it uses AI to write software. So our entire engineering team is using this. But what we've done is we've built these little agents that are all specialists in specific areas in the curriculum development process. So when we build curriculum for a university, you have to have all sorts of instructional designers, psychometricians, testers. And so each one of those, if you think about what does it take to be an instructional designer, we built that playbook as a prompt engineering guide for specific agents that we've built. So we then have all of that code. We've built essentially this conveyor belt. So when you go through this process, I mentioned this earlier, we do this programmatically. One AI engine will plan, another AI engine will write, and then a third will evaluate the work of the first two. That gets us the 85%. So when we build a course, and what we're going to be doing with Bill this summer is we start by saying, all right, what do you want to teach? Okay, we're going to teach AI and marketing, and our AI engine will propose a curriculum plan. And by curriculum plan, this is an example. Let me see if it'll scroll through this. This is about a 20 to 25 page document that normally would take an instructional design team months, if not semesters, and it takes us about 30 minutes. And so we would then give this to the subject matter expert and say, does this look right? Bill told me the other day, it's 80% right, but it feels like the average of the internet. Okay, point taken. That's why we need you to come in and give us that extra 20% and red pin this to the next level. So once the comprehensive curriculum plan is done, our conveyor belt moves along and actually writes all the articles, the quizzes, the simulations, the tests at the end of the semester, and then we send it back to Bill, bigger packet this time, okay, red pin through all of this, and then we actually deliver it either through a white label, so like the CMO Institute, or through the traditional university Canvas, Blackboard, and things like that. So this is an example of where AI, so our first case study of doing this for a third-party curriculum developer, before working with us to create 1 hour of content, they said it was taking them 200 hours. The first curriculum we built for them, which is IoT and AI manufacturing, we got it down to 6 hours to one. So it's a 33x speed increase by using this conveyor belt approach of breaking these down. So I share all that with you just to, here's all the different processes there for you to be thinking about in your own processes. What are some of those complex tasks where you say, you know what, this is really too high level for me to just dump in the ChatGPT, but how could we break that down into finite tasks? And what it allows us to do is, for Bill teaching marketing education, does this mean Bill is going to teach less? Absolutely not. It's just going to change how he's approaching it, spend more time with students, more time on those higher order things. So back to the skill inflation concept, and I'll close with this, is we're continuing to see these skills change. But it's not really job replacement, it's task replacement, it's skill replacement. And you're not going to be replaced by someone, you're not going to be replaced by AI, you're going to be replaced by someone using AI that is more effective than you because of them staying up to speed and using those tools. So, awesome.